A little girl, only 7 years old, returns home after burying her father, carrying nothing but a worn-out teddy bear in her arms. But instead of comfort, she is dragged outside by the maid, who cruelly throws a bucket of cold water over her, blaming her for the family's misfortune. Shivering, abandoned and surrounded by her scattered clothes, she sits on the ground while the neighbors close their doors and pretend not to see. Just when it seems the world has turned its back on her, a luxury car stops at the gate. A powerful millionaire in a flawless blue suit steps out, his eyes widening, in shock at the heartbreaking scene before him. With memories of his own painful childhood flooding back, he takes a deep breath, walks toward the trembling girl, and says the words that will change her life forever. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, because when you stop doing this, YouTube understands that you don't like this content and stops recommending good stories like this. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The funeral had ended only an hour earlier. The small girl, barely 7, had walked back into the house with her head lowered, clutching the worn teddy bear that was all she had left of her father. She still wore the same simple white dress from the ceremony, a little too large for her thin frame, its hem brushing against her shoes as she shuffled through the doorway. The house was supposed to feel like safety, but instead it felt like enemy ground. The moment she stepped inside, the maid's sharp eyes locked on her. The woman, tall and strong, with her uniform pressed and her apron tied too, tightly around her waist, did not hide the disdain twisting her face. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the ceremony to end, waiting for the girl to be back under her control. Without a word of comfort, the maid's hand clamped down on the child's small arm. The girl gasped, but did not resist. She'd already learned that resistance only made things worse. She looked down at her shoes, her lips trembling, whispering to the teddy bear as though it might protect her. "Move!" the maid snapped, yanking her forward. The girl stumbled, almost dropping the bear, but managed to keep. Her arms wrapped around it. She followed, dragged more than led, until they reached the back door. The yard was cold. The girl's breath shook as it left her lips. She knew what was coming, though she prayed silently that maybe, just this once, the woman would show mercy. The maid picked up a metal bucket waiting by the steps. Water sloshed inside, catching the grey light. She turned back toward the girl with a look that was equal parts annoyance and cruelty. "You brought nothing but bad luck to this house," the maid said. Her voice was low but seething, like she was spitting poison with every word. "Your father's gone, and everyone knows why. It's because of you." The child's eyes widened. Her head shook weakly, but no sound came. She could not find words, could not defend herself. She only hugged the bear tighter, her thin fingers digging into its threadbare fur. The maid stepped, closer, towering over her. "I'll wash it off, all that filth you carry. You're cursed, do you understand? Cursed." Before the girl could beg, the bucket tipped. The water came down in a heavy rush, soaking her hair, her dress, her skin. She gasped at the shock, the cold burning as though it were ice. She could barely breathe. Her teeth chattered as she tried to hold back tears, but they came anyway, mixing with the water streaming down her cheeks. The maid watched, arms folded, satisfied. "There," she muttered. "Maybe now this house will finally be free of your bad luck." The girl's knees buckled, and she sank onto the ground, still holding the bear against her chest. The toy absorbed the water, its fur darkening, its seams sagging. She whispered to it, a broken plea that no one could hear. "Please, don't leave me too." From the corner of her eye, she noticed shadows behind curtains. Faces at windows, neighbors. They had seen. For a second her heart leapt. Maybe someone would help. But as soon as her eyes met theirs, the curtains slid shut. The doors closed. Silence followed. No one stepped forward. The maid smirked. "See? No one cares." No one ever will. The child sat shivering. Her small frame curled in on itself, the soaked teddy bear clutched like a lifeline. She looked toward the closed windows one last time, her hope flickering and dying. Alone in the yard, abandoned by everyone around her, she trembled uncontrollably, the weight of grief and cold pressing down, as though the world itself had turned against her. And the neighbors, the ones who might have spoken, turned their faces away. The sound of an engine broke the silence as a dark luxury sedan rolled to a stop in front of the mansion's gates. Its polished surface reflected the fading daylight, the car out of place against the cold stillness of the street. The rear door opened with measured calm, and from it stepped a man, whose presence commanded attention even before he spoke. He was dressed in a tailored blue suit that carried the weight of wealth and authority. Every detail, from the shine of his shoes to the precision of the tie at his collar, announced discipline and control. Yet the moment his eyes lifted toward the yard, that control faltered. He froze. There on the ground sat a little girl no older than 7, her small body drenched, her thin arms wrapped desperately around a sodden teddy bear. Water still dripped from her hair, streaking down her pale face. Beside her lay a suitcase tipped on its side, its contents scattered and dirty, a dress, a pair of shoes, a folded sweater, all abandoned in the mud. The sight carried no dignity, only cruelty. The man's chest tightened as he took it in. His eyes, usually cold with calculation, flickered with something deeper, recognition. He had seen this before, though not here, not now. Long ago, in another house, it had been him, a boy shivering on the floor, treated as unwanted, made to believe he was the problem. That memory rose like a blade through his composure. He remembered nights of waiting for kindness that never came. He remembered the feeling of standing small in front of adults who looked at him not as a child, but as a burden. And now, in front of this mansion, history seemed to replay, not through him, but through this fragile girl who clutched her toy as if it were the only thing left in the world. His fists tightened at his sides. Every instinct told him to step forward, to speak, to pull her out of the mud and end the injustice written across her shivering body. For a moment, though, he simply stood still, watching her, as if to confirm what his eyes saw was real. The girl did not look at him. She kept her head low, shoulders trembling, her world narrowed to the weight of the teddy bear in her arms. But to him, she was impossible to ignore. The scene struck harder than any blow he had endured in boardrooms or battles of wealth. This was not a business transaction. This was not about money or power. It was about pain, raw, human, and undeserved. His breath deepened, and he felt a sharp ache in his chest. The resemblance to his own childhood was too clear, too precise. He felt her suffering as if it were his own, as if her silence echoed the silence he had once carried. The memory of being rejected, of being told he was nothing, whispered inside him again. But this time he was not powerless. This time he was the one arriving, the one who could change what unfolded. His gaze stayed locked on the girl, the sight imprinting itself in his mind like a wound he could not turn away from. In her, he saw not only the weight of her tragedy, but the shadow of his own past, and in that recognition, something settled inside him. A vow, quiet but unshakable. The luxury car behind him remained still, its engine cooling, but the man did not move. His entire being was focused on that small figure in the yard, drenched and abandoned. For him, it was not just pity. It was memory, it was empathy, it was a pain resurrected. He stood there stunned, overwhelmed by a single truth. The little girl's suffering was his own, and her cry, though silent, was the same cry he had once carried. The man approached slowly, each step careful, measured, as if he were stepping into a fragile world that could shatter at the slightest wrong move. He carried no grand gestures, No loud proclamations, just a quiet determination that seemed to radiate from his very presence. In his hands he held his coat, the fabric soft yet sturdy, and he approached the child with the kind of gentleness that only comes from understanding deep pain. The child, a small girl no more than 10, sat curled against herself, trembling. Her eyes, wide and glistening with tears, reflected a mixture of fear, confusion, and an almost instinctual skepticism. Life, as she had known it, had been nothing but a series of abrupt disappointments, each one eroding her trust in the world around her. Yet here, in the stillness of this moment, there was something different, an unspoken promise that this man might be the first to truly notice the fragility of her heart. He stopped a few feet away, letting her see him fully, letting her register that he was not a threat. His hands moved slowly, deliberate, as he opened the coat and lifted it over his arms. There was a softness in his gaze, an understanding that transcended words. He knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to her level, not forcing eye contact, but offering a presence that spoke of protection and care. The girl's small hand shot out almost reflexively, reaching for the coat. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge, her grip fierce and desperate. She pressed the fabric to her chest as if it were a lifeline, a shield against the pain and uncertainty that had been her constant companions. The tears still flowed freely down her cheeks, but there was a spark in her eyes now, an acknowledgement that she had been seen, that someone had chosen to stand with her, not against her. He draped the coat gently over her shoulders, careful to cover her trembling frame completely. The weight of it was more than just physical. It carried an unspoken message, a reassurance that the harshness of the world would not reach her in this moment. He adjusted the collar slightly, as one would for a delicate flower that needed support to stand upright. "It won't happen again," he said, his voice low but firm, filled with conviction. Those words, simple and unadorned, seemed to echo in the space between them. They were more than a promise. They were a declaration, a vow made silently but entirely understood. The girl blinked up at him, a mixture of disbelief and tentative hope forming in her gaze. The idea that someone could intervene, that someone could prevent further hurt, felt almost alien, yet profoundly comforting. Her small hands tightened on the coat, clutching it as though by holding it, she could hold on to the certainty he offered. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a sense of grounding, of being anchored in safety. He did not speak again, not because he had nothing left to say, but because words were no longer necessary. The act itself, the careful placement of the coat, the steady presence beside her, was enough. It was a communication deeper than language, a dialogue of trust and protection. Minutes passed without a sense of urgency, though the world around them continued to move. Time itself seemed to bend to the gravity of this shared moment, stretching long enough for the girl to absorb it fully. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her body relaxed beneath the weight of the coat. The tremors lessened, her posture eased, and a fragile sense of security began to replace the raw edge of fear. He remained kneeling there, silent but steadfast, allowing her to decide when she was ready to accept the comfort he offered. There was no rush, no imposed expectation, only the presence of someone who had chosen to act with care. The girl's eyes met his again, and this time there was no pleading in them, no demand. There was just recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of hope that had been extended to her. With a gentle nod, he ensured the coat was settled snugly over her shoulders. It was a small gesture, but in it lay the weight of protection, of vigilance, of a promise that she would not be abandoned again. She held onto it as though it were the most precious thing in the world, and perhaps, in that moment, it truly was. And then, as he stood and took a careful step back, Allowing her a sense of her own space while remaining near enough to be a guardian, he repeated his words once. More, not louder, not with flourish, but with the steady conviction that had carried him through every moment of doubt that had led to this point. It won't happen again. The maid froze the moment she noticed him. The millionaire stood at the doorway, tall and composed, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority that brooked no excuses. For a fraction of a second, she seemed unsure whether to retreat or explain herself. Then, with a trembling breath, she tried to justify her actions, the words spilling out in a rush of defensiveness. "I was only disciplining her," she said, her voice wavering. "She needed to learn to understand boundaries. I didn't mean—" He held up a hand, cutting her off without raising his voice. There was no anger in his tone, only a sharp, unyielding clarity that pierced through the excuses. His gaze settled on her, steady and unwavering, and in it she could feel the weight of recognition, not of her, but of the pain she had mirrored. He saw through the justifications, past the carefully constructed narrative, straight to the truth she tried to hide. The millionaire took a slow step forward, each movement deliberate, measured. His eyes never left hers, scanning for the lie she hoped he wouldn't uncover. But he did uncover it. He saw in her actions the same disregard he had endured as a child, the same negligence, the same cold dismissal of vulnerability. It was unmistakable, an echo of his own suffering reflected back at him in real time. "You call this discipline," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "This is cruelty." The words hit her harder than any accusation she had imagined. For a moment, she faltered, the carefully maintained facade of control beginning to crumble. She opened her mouth, but the arguments she had rehearsed failed her. There was no shield left, no deflection strong enough to mask the truth. He moved closer, his steps deliberate but not threatening, his presence commanding. "Attention. Do you understand what you've done?" he asked. "Do you see the damage you've caused?" She swallowed hard, finally confronting the enormity of her actions. The child, silent and trembling, looked up from the corner where she had been holding herself together with a fragile grip. The maid's eyes flickered briefly toward the girl, and guilt surged through her like a sudden storm, sharp and undeniable. The millionaire's voice softened slightly, but the conviction never wavered. "I recognize this behavior," he continued, his gaze now fixed on the maid with a mixture of understanding and resolve. "Because I once lived it. I know what it feels like to be ignored, dismissed, harmed by those who were meant to care, but I will not allow that history to repeat here." The maid's defense faltered further, and for the first time she looked not at him, but at herself, truly confronting the reflection of her actions. The excuses, the justifications, the rationale, all of it evaporated under the weight of his presence. She realized that discipline had been a lie she told herself to feel justified, a cover for a cruelty she could no longer deny. "You cannot teach through fear," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "You cannot claim care while causing pain. Discipline without compassion is only harm." The maid shivered, the truth settling in her chest like a heavy stone. The child's eyes, still wide and wary, glanced between them, sensing the shift, sensing the justice that had quietly arrived without theatrics or spectacle. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, only the steady, unshakable acknowledgement of wrongdoing and the beginning of accountability. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in, letting the silence speak for the countless unspoken moments of fear, confusion, and hurt. Then, without raising his voice, without gesture beyond the command of his presence, he made the final declaration. "I will not allow this neglect to continue," he said. "Not here, not to her, not ever again." The maid nodded, slightly subdued, confronted, forced to reckon with the reality of her actions. The child, still holding the edge of the coat draped over her shoulders, exhaled slowly, sensing that a protective barrier had been restored, that someone had chosen to face the truth instead of turning away. In that room, the confrontation was over. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with recognition of wrongdoing, accountability, and the first steps toward real care. The millionaire had faced the past and refused to let it infect the present, standing firm against cruelty disguised as discipline, and as he remained there, his eyes on her, steady and unwavering, the maid could no longer hide behind excuses, seeing clearly the reflection of negligence she had tried to justify. Confronted by the truth, she could no longer evade. The millionaire moved without hesitation. His eyes were fixed on the child, her small frame trembling in fear and uncertainty, yet clinging to the last thread of trust she had left. The maid, standing nearby, tried once more to interject, to weave her excuses into words, but he did not even glance at her. His attention was solely on the girl, on the urgency of rescuing her from the harm she had endured. He bent down and lifted her gently into his arms. She froze for a heartbeat, startled by the sudden movement, her hands instinctively clutching his coat, as if it were the only thing anchoring her in a world that had so often been unsafe. Then slowly, a fragile sense of relief began to settle over her. She could feel the solid, unwavering presence of someone who would not allow her to be hurt again. The maid's lips parted as if to speak, her voice sharp and filled with indignation. "She's mine! You can't—" But he did not flinch. He held the girl closer, his grip firm but tender, and his voice carried over the tense silence of the onlookers. "She comes with me." The words were simple, unwavering, and final. They cut through the excuses, the protests, and the simmering anger. In them was the authority of someone who had endured neglect and refused to let it happen again. The girl's eyes, wide and shining with a mix of fear and hope, met his. In that gaze, she recognized safety, recognition, and the promise of protection. The maid's face flushed, her anger boiling over, but she stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides, trembling with fury and frustration, yet there was nothing she could do. The power she had wielded through fear and discipline had crumbled in the face of someone who would not tolerate cruelty. She could only watch, impotent, as the man crossed the threshold of responsibility and compassion. Each step he took toward the gate was deliberate. The child nestled against his chest, her small fingers clutching the fabric of his coat, seeking reassurance in its warmth. She no longer fought or trembled as violently. The steadiness of his arms conveyed what words could not: a safe haven, a guardian who would not abandon her. The onlookers, those who had been silent witnesses to the tension, felt the gravity of the moment. The maid's fury contrasted sharply with the calm certainty of the millionaire. It was a confrontation resolved not with shouting, but with action, the unequivocal choice to protect rather than control. As they approached the gate, the child's eyes briefly flicked toward the maid. There was no accusation there, no lingering resentment, only the quiet acknowledgement that her world had shifted. The man's decision had reshaped the boundaries of safety and care, and she understood, in that silent glance, that she was being led towards something better, someone who would truly look after her. The maid opened her mouth again, perhaps to argue, perhaps to assert ownership, but the sound never came. The certainty in his posture and the unwavering resolve in his gaze silenced every protest before it could form. She stood there, furious yet powerless, as the reality of her inability to harm or command the girl settled over her like a weight she could not lift. He reached the gate, pausing only to ensure the child remained secure in his arms. She rested against him, her small body beginning to relax, sensing the protection he offered. The distance between what had been unsafe and what was now promised stretched out with each step. The act of carrying her itself, a declaration of care, of intervention, of refusal to accept neglect. Without looking back, he moved through the gate. The child, still clinging to him, felt the steady strength that had lifted her from fear into safety. Her tears, still present but quieter now, reflected relief more than sorrow. She could sense that this choice, this singular decision, had changed the course of her life. The maid remained behind, hands clenching at her sides, fury simmering but utterly impotent. The girl's departure was complete, her future now placed in the hands of someone who would protect her, nurture her, and refuse the neglect she had known. There was no room for argument, no loophole, no excuse that could reverse what had been decided. And so, as he crossed the gate carrying the child, the millionaire's voice had already declared the truth of the moment, final and unwavering. "She comes with me." The millionaire led the girl up the private elevator, each floor bringing them farther from the life she had known and closer to a space that promised safety and care. When the doors opened onto the penthouse, sunlight spilled across polished floors and expansive windows, but she barely noticed the luxury. Her attention clung to him, cautious, wary. Every step had been a lesson in fear and expectation of reprimand, of harsh words, of sudden cruelty. He guided her to a chair at a small table where neatly folded clothes lay, clean and inviting. She glanced at them with suspicion, unsure if kindness could be trusted. Hesitantly, she reached for the garments, brushing her fingers over the fabric. It was soft, familiar in a way she had rarely experienced. Clothing had always been functional or punitive, never comforting, never a signal of care. "You can change into these," he said calmly, his voice steady. "Take your time." She hesitated, lingering in the doorway of trust and doubt. The thought of doing anything without permission made her stomach twist with anxiety. In her old life, every action carried consequences, sharp words, scolding, punishment. Here, the rules. It felt different. The air itself seemed to whisper that safety existed not because of obedience, but because of choice. After a moment, she began to undress and change, each movement careful, almost ritualistic, as though stepping into the new clothes meant stepping into a new identity. The millionaire waited quietly, giving her the space to act without pressure, without judgment. No demands, no interrogations, no sudden corrections, just presence. His steady gaze, calm and unthreatening, allowed her the first small freedom she had ever known. When she finished, he gestured toward a tray laid out on the counter, a warm meal thoughtfully prepared. Steam rose from the plate, carrying scents that spoke of care and nourishment. Her hand froze just above the food, and she flinched slightly, as if expecting the first bite to trigger criticism or reproach. "You don't need to ask permission to eat," he said softly. "Here, you don't need to ask permission to exist." The words settled in her mind like sunlight after a storm, warm and illuminating. They carried no threat, no hidden conditions, no expectation beyond acceptance. She felt a weight lift, an unfamiliar freedom, settling in her chest. Hesitation softened, her small hands moving tentatively toward the food. Each bite became easier, the fear dissolving slowly, replaced by the quiet wonder of simply being allowed to nourish herself without fear. He sat across from her, watching but not intruding. His presence was steady, a silent reassurance that no harm would come, that she could finally experience care without strings attached. For the first time in her life, she could eat freely, feel fullness without guilt, and allow herself the simplest human comfort. The warmth of the meal reached deeper than her stomach. It touched something long dormant within her, a sense of belonging, of acknowledgement, of being seen not as a problem to manage, but as a person deserving of care. She realized, gradually, that safety was not a matter of obedience or appeasement, but of trust extended and accepted. With each bite, her posture relaxed. The tension that had been a permanent fixture in her shoulders and spine began to ease. Her eyes, still wary, flickered occasionally toward him, reading not judgment, but genuine concern. He offered no speeches, no platitudes, only quiet protection, the simple radical act of allowing her to exist without fear. She finished the meal, sitting back slightly, a small smile breaking through the habitual apprehension. It was a smile not of relief alone, but of cautious discovery, an acknowledgement that this moment was hers, safe and unthreatened. She was allowed to be, allowed to take up space, allowed to breathe. The millionaire nodded once, approvingly but softly, as if recognizing her first steps into a life where her value was inherent, not conditional. The trust had begun, tentative but real, bridging the gap between fear and hope, between the pain of the past and the possibility of a future filled with care. For the first time, she ate without fear. The girl held the wet teddy bear close, its soaked fur pressing against her small hands. She had hugged it countless times in moments of fear and loneliness, a fragile comfort in a world that had offered little warmth. But today, something felt different. As she pressed her fingers against the fur, she noticed a small, uneven seam along the back, a stitch that didn't belong. Curiosity prickled at her, sharp and insistent, overriding the hesitation she had learned to carry like a second skin. Carefully, she traced the line with her fingernail, lifting the thread until a tiny opening revealed itself. Inside, tucked in a hidden pocket, lay a small object she had never expected, a compact black pen drive. Her eyes widened. Her heart raced. How had it ended up here, in something so ordinary, so overlooked? She pulled it out, holding it delicately, as if it were a fragile bird, unsure of the consequences that might follow. The millionaire, standing nearby, noticed the intensity in her gaze. "What is it?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. She hesitated, then opened her hand. I found this inside the bear," she whispered, the words trembling as they left her mouth. "I don't know what it is." He crouched to her level, studying the pen drive carefully. His expression shifted subtly, a shadow passing over his features. Something about the way it had been hidden so deliberately set off alarms in his mind. He took it gently from her hand, examining it without touching more than necessary, as though even the act of handling it required care. "Show me where you found it," he said. The girl lifted the bear, pointing to the tiny seam she had discovered. He inspected the stitching, noting the irregularity, the intention behind concealing something within an object meant to comfort a child. The thought sent a chill through him. Who would hide such a thing, and why in a toy belonging to a little girl? Back in his private study, they plugged the pen drive into his computer. The screen flickered to life, and a series of files appeared, labeled in ways that seemed innocuous at first glance. But the content was anything but. They clicked on the first file, a recording, and were met with voices that immediately drew his attention. The conversations were unmistakable. They revealed lies, betrayals, and secrets kept from him for years. Names whispered in, conspiracies, discussions of actions taken behind closed doors, decisions that had caused harm, and implications of a role in his father's death. The voice of someone he had once trusted, now revealed in cold, undeniable evidence, cut through the air like a knife. The girl watched silently, her small hands clasped together, her eyes wide but steady. She had no context for all the adult complexities, yet she sensed the gravity, the tension that crackled between the man and the recordings. Even without understanding every detail, she felt the weight of truth, of hidden sins coming to light, and the importance of what she had discovered. He paused after the first few recordings, his gaze resting on her. "You found this?" he asked, not accusing, but in awe at the significance of her discovery. She nodded, gripping the bear a little tighter. "I didn't know what it was. I just thought it was, I don't know, something secret." He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face, absorbing the revelations. This "This explains so much," he murmured, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He looked at her, the child who had unknowingly uncovered a hidden piece of a puzzle that had haunted him for years. You've done more than you know." Together, they continued through the files, piecing together the story the recordings revealed. Betrayals from those closest to him, schemes carefully constructed to obscure motives, and connections to the mysterious. Circumstances surrounding his father's death. Each revelation deepened the gravity, each secret uncovered a thread that wove through a tapestry of deception, manipulation, and hidden agendas. Yet in the midst of the tension, the girl's presence reminded him why the discovery mattered now. Not just for him, but for the future. She had found the courage to look beyond fear, to uncover the hidden truth without knowing the full consequences. The teddy bear, once a simple comfort, had become a vessel for revelation, bridging past betrayals and the promise of justice. As the last recording played, silence settled in the study. The pen drive had revealed all it could, its secrets now in the hands of those who would face them. He looked down at the girl, her eyes reflecting both wonder and a cautious pride. She had uncovered the truth without even fully realizing the weight of her actions, and, in doing so, had changed the course of his search for answers. The teddy bear remained in her hands, now more than just a toy, a keeper of secrets, a witness to discovery, a symbol of courage born from innocence. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, silently acknowledging her role in unveiling what had long been hidden. And as she clutched the bear once more, pressing it against her chest, the pen drive safely stored nearby, the girl understood something profound. Even the smallest hands could uncover the heaviest truths, and even a simple toy could hold the secrets that change everything. The discovery began with the teddy bear. The millionaire moved quickly, determined not to let the past continue unchallenged. He had seen enough, heard enough, and now, with the girl safe, he turned his attention to ensuring the truth would not be buried. The first step was gathering witnesses, those who had quietly observed the mistreatment, but had been too fearful or powerless to speak. It began with neighbors. One by one they came forward, some hesitant, some trembling, recounting what they had seen over the months. A man from across the street described a night when he had seen the maid striking the child, her fury, disproportionate to any misbehavior. Another neighbor, a mother of two, recalled instances when the girl had been sent out into the cold for minor mistakes, shivering and pleading for mercy. Each testimony painted a consistent picture, each voice adding weight to the claims that had long been whispered in fear and silence. Even those on the fringes of society joined the chorus. A homeless man, familiar with the alleyways and corners near the girl's home, approached quietly, his voice low but steady. "I saw it too," he said, gripping a worn cap in his hands. "I saw how she treated her, how she hurt her. I never thought anyone would believe me, but it's true." The millionaire listened to each account, taking careful notes, asking precise questions. He was meticulous, knowing that each statement would matter if the case reached justice, but more than that, he was deliberate in creating a space where these witnesses could speak without fear of retaliation. He reassured them, offering calm authority and unwavering attention, a stark contrast to the fear and silence that had surrounded the girl's life for so long. The girl watched from nearby, still holding the teddy bear that had recently revealed hidden truths. She understood little of the legal process, but she could sense the gravity, the shift, the way her voice, though small, was now supported by others. She had been powerless before, but now, through the courage of others and the unwavering determination of the man who had rescued her, a tide of accountability began to rise. With each testimony, a narrative emerged, undeniable in its clarity. patterns of cruelty, neglect, and intimidation became impossible to dismiss. The millionaire documented everything: the dates, the events, the consistent behavior. His resolve strengthened with every detail, fueled not by vengeance, but by a commitment to justice for the girl, and for the friend he had lost, the one whose voice could no longer rise against wrongdoing. He paused at one point, looking at the girl and then at the gathered witnesses. "We are not just proving cruelty," he said quietly but firmly. "We are honoring the truth, ensuring it cannot be hidden again. This is for her, and for those who cannot speak for themselves anymore." The witnesses nodded, understanding the weight of their participation. Some wiped away tears, others clenched fists, a mixture of relief and apprehension in their expressions. They had spoken into the void before, but now the void had filled with attention, with action, with a promise that the truth would have its consequence. The millionaire worked late into the day, compiling the evidence, corroborating stories, and preparing to take the matter to authorities. Each piece of proof, each witness account, strengthened the foundation of justice he was determined to build. He was aware that this would not erase the past, but it would ensure accountability, it would prevent future harm, and it would honor the memory of those who could no longer defend themselves. The girl, finally sensing the weight of protection around her, allowed herself a small measure of hope. She had survived fear and cruelty, but now she was learning the power of truth, the courage in speaking out, and the strength of having allies who would not falter. As the day drew to a close, the last witnesses gave their statements, each reaffirming what had been hidden for so long. The millionaire reviewed the compiled evidence, the photographs, the recordings, the accounts, and the sworn statements. The picture was clear. The truth would not be denied. He turned to the girl, kneeling slightly so that his gaze met hers. "We are ready," he said, a steady assurance in his voice. "The truth will be heard." Outside, in the streets and alleyways, voices that had been silent for too long began to rise, confirming what had been feared but never spoken aloud. Justice, deliberate and unwavering, was taking shape, and so, with the witnesses' accounts secured, the evidence compiled, and the determination unshakable, the millionaire prepared to bring the truth to light, not only for the girl, but also for the friend who could no longer defend himself, ensuring that the cruelty would be met with accountability. The process of justice had begun. The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension, the kind that presses on the chest without making a sound. The girl sat beside the millionaire, her small hands gripping the edge of the table, her heart racing. Every face in the room carried anticipation, but she had only one focus: the truth. She had carried it silently for so long, and now, for the first time, she was allowed to speak without fear. The judge looked down, calm and attentive, waiting for the proceedings to begin. The maid sat across the room, her composure strained, her eyes flicking nervously between the girl and the evidence displayed on the screen. For months, she had hidden behind lies, excuses, and cruelty. Today, those defenses would crumble. When the girl was called to testify, she rose slowly, trembling but determined. The weight of the past pressed on her shoulders, but the presence of the man who had rescued her steadied her. She took a deep breath, her voice shaking at first, then gaining strength as she spoke the words she had kept locked inside. "If they cared about me," she said, looking directly at the judge, "they wouldn't have laughed when I cried." The courtroom fell silent. Even the maid seemed momentarily frozen, her mask slipping as the truth in the girl's voice echoed through the room. The statement was simple, yet it carried the full force of years of neglect, fear, and emotional abuse. The judge nodded, acknowledging the gravity of her words. Next, the pen drive was presented. The files were opened one by one, revealing recordings that left no room for doubt. Voices that had whispered secrets, plans, and betrayals now filled the air. their content undeniable. The maid's carefully constructed image of authority and care began to unravel, each recording tearing away the facade she had relied upon for so long. The millionaire watched closely as the recordings played, ensuring that the girl remained composed, even as the weight of the evidence became clear. The files confirmed what had been suspected: abuse, manipulation, and deliberate concealment of truths. Every whisper, every hidden recording painted a picture that no lie could obscure. As the recordings ended, the maid's demeanor collapsed completely. Her face flushed with anger and shame, her eyes darting around the room for escape, but there was none. The law had been armed with the truth, and there was no place left for her deception. Her hands trembled as the bailiffs moved forward. "She is under custody," the judge declared, her tone firm. "She is charged with abuse and conspiracy. This court will ensure accountability." The girl felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had spoken, and the truth, had been seen and heard. The evidence she had uncovered, combined with her testimony, had dismantled the power of fear that had governed her life for so long. The maid was being led away, no longer untouchable, no longer able to inflict harm or manipulate. Justice was not just an abstract idea. It was real, immediate, and irrevocable. The girl returned to her seat, clutching the teddy bear that had hidden the pendrive, feeling the weight of courage and truth settle over her. She glanced at the millionaire, who gave her a small nod, a silent affirmation of the strength she had shown. He had guided her to safety, yes, but today she had taken a vital step herself. The courtroom slowly began to breathe again. Witnesses shifted in their seats. Lawyers exchanged papers, and the judge prepared to move to the next stage of the trial. Yet the impact of her words lingered, powerful and clear. A declaration that could not be ignored or dismissed. The maid, escorted under custody, cast one last look toward the girl, a mixture of fury and defeat. She had lost control, her lies exposed, her authority shattered. The pendrive and the girl's testimony had revealed the truth that had long been hidden. And as the girl watched her leave, she felt an unfamiliar sense of power, tempered with relief. Her voice had been heard, her fear acknowledged, and the truth had triumphed. In that courtroom she had found courage. The courtroom had cleared, the final statements made, and the weight of truth now rested in the hands of justice. With the maid removed from power and her misdeeds exposed, the girl could finally breathe without the ever-present shadow of fear. The judge, reviewing all the evidence and testimony, made the provisional custody decision. The millionaire's name was called, confirming what both he and the girl had hoped for: she would be safe under his care. He extended his hand to her gently, and she took it, feeling a mixture of relief, excitement, and a cautious hope she had never dared to entertain before. His presence was steady, reassuring, and for the first time in her life she felt a sense of permanence. No more fleeting moments of safety, no more temporary shelters or fearful obedience, just a consistent, unwavering figure who promised protection and care. He smiled, soft, but full of meaning, and led her out of the courtroom. Each step toward the exit carried a sense of liberation. She had survived abuse, deceit, and neglect, and now, with the legal confirmation behind them, a new chapter began. Her fingers intertwined with his, a silent acknowledgement of trust being placed and accepted. As they reached the car, waiting outside, the girl clutched her teddy bear tightly, the one that had hidden so many truths. It had been her companion through darkness, through fear, and now it became a symbol of resilience and revelation. He helped her settle inside, ensuring she felt comfortable, safe, and above all acknowledged. The drive to his residence was quiet, yet not silent in its significance. Words were unnecessary. Every glance, every subtle gesture communicated what they both understood: A life once dictated by fear and uncertainty was giving way to one built on trust, protection, and genuine care. The millionaire glanced at her in the rearview mirror, seeing not just a child, but a young life beginning to reclaim its potential. When they arrived, he opened the door for her, guiding her inside. The space was welcoming and structured, a stark contrast to the chaos and cruelty she had endured. She stepped over the threshold tentatively, her small hand still in his, and allowed herself to absorb the security surrounding her. For the first time, she felt that home was not a place that punished or demanded compliance. It was a sanctuary that nurtured. He knelt to meet her at eye level, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "Now," he said, his voice steady, filled with warmth, "you will never be alone again." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were not of fear. They were a mix of relief, gratitude, and a burgeoning sense of hope. She had spent years believing that love and safety were privileges reserved for others, but this moment proved otherwise. She allowed herself to imagine a future where she could laugh without fear, sleep without dread, and be guided by someone who truly cared for her well-being. Over the following days, the routine of care and stability began to take shape. He provided meals, clothing, and schooling, but more importantly, he offered patience, understanding, and respect. She learned that mistakes could be met with guidance instead of punishment, that questions could be asked without ridicule, and that her emotions were valid. Slowly, the walls of defensiveness she had built around her heart began to crumble. Even in small gestures, the connection deepened. A shared laugh over a simple story, a quiet moment reading together, the way he listened to her thoughts and fears. Each act became a brick in a foundation of trust. She began to speak more freely, to express needs and desires without hesitation, and in response he provided reassurance and validation, something she had never received consistently before. The past was never forgotten. The scars of abuse, the memories of neglect, and the pain of betrayal remained, but they no longer defined her present. Justice had been served, truth had been acknowledged, and the foundation for healing was being laid. Her heart, once guarded and wary, began to expand with the possibility of love, care, and belonging. He watched her one afternoon, seated with her teddy bear at her side, and realized that their relationship had evolved beyond caretaker and child. He was a guardian, a mentor, and increasingly a father figure. She, in turn, began to see him as someone dependable, someone who could be trusted to protect, guide, and nurture her. As she grew, the bond was fragile in its beginnings, yet strong in its sincerity, and as she rested her head slightly against his shoulder, a quiet comfort settling between them. The story of fear and cruelty that had dominated her life began to give way to a narrative of hope, resilience, and love. And justice had been done, wounds had been acknowledged, and a new life was beginning. A life where safety, care, and belonging were not privileges, but rights. With the provisional custody secured and the future uncertain but promising, the girl finally understood what it meant to belong, to trust, and to hope. She was no longer alone. "Now," he repeated softly with conviction, "you will never be alone again." And in that simple declaration, a new chapter began. A home, a guardian, and the first seeds of a life filled with love. For more stories that matter, join our community. Subscribe to Say Tales.